Hey guys, it's Nicole at the Pearl Review. How are you doing? Right now, recording this, I am in maybe the third week of self-isolation. I don't know. I can't keep track. What year is it? I know a lot of you are probably in the same boat. And actually, since I can't work from home, I've been reading a lot of nonfiction and watching a lot of documentaries and just trying to get things done and be constructive in a way that makes me happy and sane. So if that helps you, I am just going to do something I normally don't do and give you 4 nonfiction and 4 documentary recommendations rather than doing a thorough review. I hope you're okay. Take care. Big virtual hug. And if you have any recommendations for me, please feel free to comment below, or if you just want to say hi. Yeah, I hope you enjoy this, and thank you so much for watching. All right, party people, let's do this. The first thing I read was From Dawn to Decadence by Jacques Barzun. This author, I think, was at the level of like a Michael Pollan or Malcolm Gladwell, but recently he hasn't been as popular. I think it was just, matter of time for all these kind of guys. From Dawn to Decadence is a cultural survey of the Occident, as in the Western European nations and the United States as well. And this cultural survey goes from 1500 to 2000, so kind of a big book. It's like 800 pages and it's a bit of a clunker. It's remarkable that Barzun manages to do this all on his own. I actually think this would be a really good book, though, had he maybe collaborated with like-minded people. The book focuses on the arts, but it also notes major wars, historic events, and scientific advances. However, it's idiosyncratic. It's not an end-all, be-all on the subject. It's more of a survey of what Barzun himself learned in his lifetime and what he found interesting. He also becomes cantankerous, and some of his prejudices do bubble to the surface from time to time. Also, he chooses lesser known figures sometimes to give attention to what are, in his mind, underrated figures. This book isn't like a linear history book. Many parts feel like brief encyclopedia entries, but, after a while, it kind of feels like a tidal wave of names that kind of crushes you sometimes. So it's not a perfect book, but I really can't help but admire Barzun for sharing this, for knowing all this stuff. I now know a lot of, different figures that I'm curious about, that I want to learn more about, or books that I've heard of that I thought, okay, this is a really good recommendation and makes me want to know more. And it's also just nice to kind of see the different cultural peaks and valleys from such a long period. It's really interesting. I also just finished Technics and Human Development by Lewis Mumford. He wrote a lot of similar works, and he's a bit of a polymath. He's like a mid-century kind of guy, sort of like Jacques Berzon. So I'm just going to quote Wikipedia here. Lewis Mumford was an American historian, sociologist, philosopher of technology, and literary critic. Particularly, he's noted for his studies on cities and urban architecture, but he had a broad career as a writer. He actually shows up in Barzun, but I had heard about him before through Goodreads. Um, this is a beautiful book. I really enjoyed it, and it's an anthropological history book, if you will. I think that Mumford is an extraordinary mind and he needs to be better known. It's once again one of those issues where someone really incredible kind of has his own, 15 minutes of fame. But yeah, he should still be read today. This book is a brief history of humanity from the point we start walking upright until the Renaissance. And that's not too shabby for 300 pages. He describes beautifully what our progression to consciousness and later to civilization, um, how that comes about, and some of his ideas are refuting like popular ideas of his time. He actually begins the book by arguing that the belief that man became more intelligent, became what he was through utilizing tools is completely wrong, at least in his opinion. He says that language was the first real invention. And he uses the word invention in an unconventional way, I guess. He thinks language is an invention, civilization is an invention, farming is an invention. But he makes great arguments for that, for his case. I really love this book, and it actually is written, certain parts are very beautiful. And anyone who has an interest in prehistory or anthropology should definitely check it out. I'm also excited to revisit and finally finish Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. This was a book that was like a really big deal when it came out, I think in the late 90s. And it's actually kind of similar to the last book I just mentioned, but except Jared Diamond's main bone to pick is different. He writes the book in order to show how each civilization is no better than the other. I think there were contentions that, there's a reason why, Western European nations begin colonizing and, form empires and take over these non-Western civilizations. And he calls out people who suggest that as racists basically, and really goes down to the nuts and bolts as to how each civilization got to where they are. It starts out with agricultural history and the resources that these people have, and then follow them along. And I really enjoyed this book when I started reading it many years ago. I think maybe my attention span might have been a little bit shorter then. I have no reason for not finishing this, so I'm excited to finally have the time. Finally, my fourth recommendation is Just Kids by Patti Smith. This is one of my favorite books, full stop, period. Patti Smith describes the first few years of her life in New York City during the 70s. She tells us about Robert Mapplethorpe, her best friend slash boyfriend, who also became famous as a photographer, and about her becoming the Patti Smith that we know and love today. Along the way, we meet many of the famous fixtures of the scene, including Allen Ginsberg and Jimi Hendrix. Smith is poetic, dreamy, humble, loving, and lovable. I know a lot of people who cherish this book and have been recommending this one to people for a very long time. All right, moving on to documentaries. So I just finished watching Bill Cunningham, New York, a few days ago. That is free on Amazon Prime if you have it. Bill Cunningham was a photographer and he captured New York street fashion for, I think, 40 years. But also, he lives in basically a filing cabinet in Carnegie Hall. So he's totally unpretentious and he's inspiringly passionate and cheerful. And this documentary was really well done. It had a lot of great interviews, and if you're into New York history, it's definitely a lovely documentary. A classic documentary that I really love is Sherman's March by Ross McAlwee. I think you spell that Mcelwee. McAlwee has this way of capturing people that is just incredibly intimate and honest. His eye is like none other, and he is one of those directors that just make art. So Sherman's March is his traveling through the South after a recent breakup, and he's asked to make this documentary on Sherman's March. And so he goes to the South and he follows Sherman's March, his historic path of pillaging. And along the way, he meets friends and family, and they're just trying to set him up with anyone that they know. So he is doing his own war path, basically, meeting these interesting people. This is maybe his most famous work, and it's unusual and it's interesting. A short documentary that's just unpretentious but still really artsy and instantly appealing is Garlic is as Good as 10 Mothers by Les Blank. If you're into documentaries, if people like Werner Herzog. Les Planck actually made the short Werner Herzog Eats His Own Shoe, which happens after he loses a bet. But Garlic is as Good as 10 Mothers is this short documentary that was made in the 70s when garlic was not as cool. Who knew? Like, how? Just why? So he captures a garlic festival that happened in California at the time. We meet a lot of hippies that are like protesting against people's bias against it. It's just a lot of fun. Les Blind captures the simple pleasures of life. Like he does a lot of food and music documentaries, and I think this is a good place to start with him. Finally, I have been on a total Werner Herzog kick lately and wanted to leave you with one of the ones that like dovetail nicely with two of my nonfiction fiction recommendations. Cave of Forgotten Dreams. Werner Herzog gets this chance to film inside of France's Chauvet cave. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I haven't watched this in a bit, but it's a really good documentary. Um, so basically, the drawings there are 30,000 years old. And this documentary is so beautiful and poetic. And if the history slash anthropological books, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and the Lewis Mumford book sounded appealing to you, I would definitely check this out. This has been on my mind because of it. Anyhow, those are my recommendations. I hope you found something interesting. If you want to recommend me something, please do. And stay safe outside or inside. If you're out there because you have to, I wish you could stay inside, and thank you for all that you do.